whatever. So give me an example when you were actually doing the lesson with the students, when they were actually engaged and working with partners. What did that look like?
Okay, so they would kind of mimic what it is that I do, and they would maybe ask each other questions, or if they're working on a particular assignment, they would ask the question, and then if the student gives an answer, they would say, well, tell me how you know that, or explain to me, give me some supporting details. Because whenever we're reading, or if we're looking at a passage that goes along with a scientific text, they have to know what the main idea of the text is, because otherwise they may try to learn something that is not the focal point of what the lesson is about. So they keep it to where they're still geared to what it is that we're asking. So say for instance, they're pairing up and they're using their study notes to study for an upcoming test. They may ask and then they may give an answer. It may just be a text, a vocabulary term, and then they may say, explaining how that process works. Like right now, the water cycle, and we were talking about the going from one stage to another. But when you go from basically the ocean water to evaporation, or evaporation of the ocean water to condensation, they would ask, what is the process of that? What is involved with that? And then they would expect that the student would say that, and they did ask that because they always had to talk about what the sun's role was. So that's how they would talk about the evaporation, and the student would need to reply with talking about temperature, something dealing with the temperature, or dealing with one of the scientific terms. Evaporation would then go into condensation, and then the clouds would get heavy, and the temperature or the weather may change, and then it causes precipitation. And then the precipitation could come in the form of, depending on the sun's role, it could be rain, it could be snow, it could be sleet, things like that. It doesn't necessarily always have to be rain. So then they would have to explain what process is happening when that precipitation would change. And then once it lands on maybe the mountains or the grass or on the hills, that when it goes into surface runoff and collection, they would have to explain how that happens, and things like that.
Okay, so how do you identify and support students with diverse learning needs in relation to their cultural background?
Well,
in your classroom and even in this lesson.
Okay, so with that, we would I always think about, since this is earth science, we talk about different regions. Students may be from somewhere else but happen to live here. We also talk about different regions because we talk about climate. So that's when we get into the geography of the lesson, and we talk about on one side of the earth, or even on our side of the coast, we may be here in Atlanta or here in the South, and then they may go on vacation during the Christmas holidays or during summer break, and they may go to their grandparents' house, but their summers may be different from the summers in Georgia. So they may go to, say for instance, Maryland or New York, and it's 70 degrees in Maryland. It's kind of cool. You may still want to have on a jacket if you live in the South, but to people in up north, they may walk around with shorts on. And then vice versa, when those family members come down south, they may say it's way too hot to be outside, but 90 degrees is fabulous for us. They may feel like it's 110 in the shade, things like that.
So for this lesson, since you're talking about, you were dealing with rain and the climate and geography, so how did you support students who were, if you were familiar with some students that came from diverse backgrounds and not used to this climate that we're in, or even the weather? So how did you address the lesson in regards to those students?
Well, I would ask them, they may even ask, or I would introduce that first. Has anybody ever lived somewhere where the weather was not like how it is here in the South? And that would start the conversation. And then some students would say, when they make those visits, or when they used to live somewhere else, that they never wore certain types of clothing because the weather never permitted for that.
Right.
And then I would ask them, so tell us how often it would rain, and how is the climate usually where you were from, or where you've experienced or visited. And they may have lived close to some water, like the ocean. That could have some hand in the change of the atmosphere that they're in. But
so how do you draw those experiences into your lesson? How did you draw it into this lesson with the water?
Well, the water cycle is going to happen the same way everywhere. So that's real world. However, it's just going to depend on how close they are to the sun, and whether they are in a certain season. It's also going to talk about the culture that they're around, because you could be somewhere that it snows all the time and it's always cold and you never see the ground. Or it's somewhere that's tropical and you never really see a lot of the sun, but it's always, you see, you have certain types of animals, and some people have never seen elephants, things like that. So the culture is always going to depend on where they're from, and it's always good to know that people are from somewhere else, because you can't anticipate the conversation to always be the same. And that helps with the respect for others, when you learn different things about different people from different places.
And I like when you use the word respect, because a lot of times we as humans, we have a tendency to judge others based on our beliefs, our culture, and our surroundings. So how do you help your students to understand that it's okay to be different, even when it comes to the weather, even when it comes to the climate?
Really, it's actually a good conversation, because the students, they learn different things. And I often just say it like that, where people are different. Everybody's different. You don't want to be the same, because then life will be boring. So and then we also allow the students to ask questions, and they always say, well, this might sound like a crazy question, but they feel like that because they may not understand somebody's background, but they're so interested that they have to ask a question that they feel like is probably a crazy question, because they're not used to it.
Yeah, when they have questions, somebody else has the same question.
Exactly.
So that's a good thing to encourage your students. It's okay to ask, because that's how you learn.
Right.
And somebody else is sitting around you who has that same question or thought. Even as adults, we go through that same kind of thing.
And and we really don't know, because like, I'm just going to ask this question because I know somebody else wants to know too. But and it's an honest question, but it makes so much sense. Yes, and it's always good to learn, because then that's how you broaden your horizons. And I always want the students to always explore, and that's part of our learning, our learning targets too, because we have to ask questions to gain information in order to analyze certain situations and plan and carry out investigations.
Okay, good answer.